you're first, right off the bat, turn your argument against them because you're actually going to be harming civilians. The reason is that when you give extra force to like a government force, like what would happen if you had offensive force, the rebels don't just go away. What happens is they think that they can no longer confront the government head on, so in order to get leverage, they turn to asymmetric warfare, transforming the world of war from soldier-on-soldier violence into soldier-on-civilian violence. That's the one for Pepper, who finds a 1,700 increase in the total amount of civilian deaths. But second, keep in mind that even if they prove a de-escalation of the conflict and a de-intensification, that doesn't matter. To the point where Sankey Kim of the University of Iowa explains that what happens when you give extra force to the government, they feel they have no incentive to stop fighting because they're backed by the UN, which empirically lengthens the duration of the conflict. That means even if they prove that the intensity goes down, since the duration increases, more civilians are going to die, it's still going to be bad on net. Then they give you a couple pieces of evidence from Brooks and Pepper saying that like it reduces violence. This is actually going to be really, really good for our side. The reason is that Brooks is talking about civilian protection measures and Pepper is talking about robust peacekeeping. Neither of those are offensive forces. Both of those are not offensive forces. No actual reason to vote for us. To the point where we can solve the problem with not using offensive force, not compromising the legitimacy of the United Nations. It's going to be a crucial reason why you're going to negate today's round. Then they tell you it's going to be deterring people. The problem is that's not true in the real world, to the point where we look in the Congo where deterrence isn't working at all and the rebel group is still out there, it's not confirmed. The last point is that they're giving you no reason why the UN has to take these options. When we look in the real world, there's other regional actors who, according to Murat Golding of the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, actually have 3 times the success rate of the United Nations. Even if you buy what they're saying, since they're crowding on a more effective organization, it's actually a reason to vote for us. Now to the next intention, which talks about like using peacekeepers in Ukraine. There's a lot of problems with this. The first one is something that Will alluded to in Crossfire. Namely, Russia is on the Security Council. They will never let the peacekeepers go into the Ukraine. Their card tells us that like they will lose the veto power. That's only if the Russian invasion is confirmed. To the point where they're not actually invading, they're just backing the rebels. And to the point where they've been doing this for the last 2 years and it still hasn't been confirmed. It's never going to get confirmed in the future. They are never going to intervene there. But next, look to the fact that even if they did intervene, they would never stop them. To the point where if they're going to try to confront Russia, the 9th most populous nation in the world, the 3rd largest military in the world, they'll never succeed. There's 0 probability of success. Then they tell you you're going to be using drones. That's not offensive force, that's surveillance. But fourth, they talk about next they talk about nuclear war. Here's where you turn against them. Because if you start attacking the United Nations attacks Russia, they're probably going to be withdrawing from the United Nations. At that point, you lose a very crucial check on like de-escalating conflicts between like Russia and other nations. If you lose that check on stopping nuclear war, you actually increase the probability of nuclear war if you vote for them. Now to the next intention, which talks about domestic spending. 2 problems. First, they give you exactly 0 real-world analysis. They give you no real-world example. We literally have no way to weigh this argument. But second, this actually takes out all their offense. The reason is that if increasing UN spending leads to decreased domestic military spending, that means the total military spending remains constant. It means you're not actually seeing any increase in force in the region. You're not actually going to be stopping the conflict at all. Their own evidence is a reason to vote negative.
So you talk about how if there's a decrease in spending domestically and there's an increase in UN spending, that it cancels out. Why does that make sense?
Because that's what I don't think
it's not like a one-to-one relationship. That's not what we're saying.
Then what are you? So you're telling us what are you saying?
So what we're saying is that right now these war-torn nations are locked in a cycle of conflict. To maintain security, these governments are having to spend a ton of money on security. When the UN intervenes and provides that security, the governments don't have to spend on security. It's just spend on health and education.
Like right where they're doing offensive force now. 2 questions on that.
Yeah.
One, how much has domestic spending on security reduced in the Congo? And my second question is, what is the probability that the incredibly corrupt Joseph Kabila regime in the Congo is going to be using those extra money for anything good rather than his own profit?
Okay, so first, the intervention in the conflict in the Congo hasn't actually finished yet, so we can't really tell. But second, when we look holistically, instead of one isolated example, we see that it empirically happens.
Let's look holistically.
Yeah.
So that clearly means there's been more than one UN offensive intervention, right?
Right, that's what we show you in our first convention.
Where else have they intervened?
In Cote d'Ivoire, Yemen, Libya, and Mali.
Really? They used offensive force in Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
What exactly actually did they do?
So what they were doing is that they went in and they went beyond the traditional definition of self-defense and what you bring up about the problem.
That's actually not what happened in Cote d'Ivoire.
To protect civilians.
What actually happened in Cote d'Ivoire, right? You had the previous president, Laurent Gbagbo, sorry, I forgot his first name. Then you have the person who was next elected in a sketchy election, but technically democratic elected, which is Laurent Ouattara. They had a civil war between them because Gbagbo refused to concede the election. They were just protecting the civilians in the civil war. They weren't going on an offensive against any of the forces.
Okay, no, they actually were doing more than what they've been doing before. They were using a more offensive stance, and that was working.
The design was to protect civilians. It's still robust peacekeeping.
Well, no, because they were using more offensive mandate. Like, what ended up happening in the end? They had to take, like, one side had to
the
win.
violence still is going on, right? The Urtar-Gbagbo conflict still rages.
Well, Brooks actually finds that there's been impressive success in all four of these
yeah,
examples.
and it's
there's
not
been a decrease in violence.
Wait, offensive?
So
the problem is
ending. You're looking like too far in the past.
No. The problem is that like in order to be offensive, your idea has to be like to wipe out the other group. We're not trying to wipe out the group.
That's a very extreme definition of offensive. Nope. All offensive means is taking a preemptive stance to attack these people.
Not if the purpose is to protect civilian. That's distinct. That's distinct. That's robust peacekeeping.
That only counts if there's an extremely imminent threat to the civilians. If you're taking a more preemptive
what they're
approach,
doing in
that's
Cote d'Ivoire.
offensive.
Your own author Pepper, who's the empirics on that, contrasts robust peacekeeping with force used beyond self-defense. They specifically contrast this. Our definition is coming from your author. No, contrasting is the opposite.
Right, but that's not what he actually does.
No, his table on page 211 of his book specifically has at the top robust peacekeeping, and then right below it, force used beyond defense of the mandates.
Okay. All right, War and Supremacy.
All right, everyone ready? Okay. Got it? The first way you can vote pro is the analysis that Lawton gives you at the top of his rebuttal. He tells you that because the resolution is asking us whether or not they should have the power, that means in the neg world they will never have the power to engage in offensive operations. Thus, if we prove that one example of offensive operations will work and should work, then or should be implemented, then we can win this round. And in today's context, that's Ukraine. Look to our second contention about Ukrainian conflict and how peacekeepers can solve. According to The Guardian, if we use drones, intelligence drones, and buttress the offensive operations with peacekeepers with this intelligence, we can reduce the amount of arms going over the border, which will stop the conflict. My opponents respond to this by saying that we'll never succeed attacking Russia. They don't really understand what's happening in this contention, though. We're saying we're intervening between the separatists and the Ukrainian government. The separatists are not actually, well, Russia denies backing the separatists, and that's another reason why Russia won't actually veto. They have no political reason to veto because they say they're not backing the separatists. Actually vetoing would just admit to backing internationally condemned behavior. So they won't actually veto because it'll just reflect poorly on them. Now the second reason you can affirm in today's round is because we're actually shifting development spending to the host nations. In the status quo, these countries are ridden in a conflict and poverty cycle, I guess. By sending peacekeepers in, this means that the host nations will have to spend as much on military spending, and instead, empirically according to Stein, they spend more on health and education, solving the root of the conflict, which is poverty, and their humanitarian problems. Now, my opponent tried to tell you that offensive operations trade off with domestic spending and that somehow cancels out, but we're actually replacing the domestic military spending with more effective operational spending with the UN, which is the third way you can vote pro, that is effective at stopping conflict. My opponents essentially say in every single situation with offensive force, it hasn't worked. Look to specifically the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When offensive force was used there, it stopped the conflict, the M23 rebels were taken out, and in fact it shortened the duration of the conflict substantially. My opponents then say robust peacekeeping isn't actually offensive, but that's just using whatever force needed to protect the mandate. That includes offensive force. And when we see that robust peacekeeping decreases civilian deaths by 31%, you can feel comfortable affirming.
Okay, is everybody ready? Overview, 2 reasons to vote for the negative. On the overview, she says that all you need to prove is that one example where you need to use offensive force. The problem isn't the resolutionality. When you affirm, you give all peacekeeping operations the option to use offensive force. That means the UN is likely to use them in more scenarios than just one. Even if they prove that it works in one scenario, that makes the other scenarios in the general case worse, that's sufficient for you to vote negative. Okay, the first reason you vote negative is the idea how offense is going to be escalating conflict. This operates as a prerequisite to their case in 3 ways. First, if we win escalation, it means that the civilians are better off. That's a prerequisite to the first connection. Second, it means that it's likely that the Ukraine operation will fail as well. And third, it means that military spending is going to increase because the conflict is escalating. Here's how we prove this. We're telling you with the Allen analysis, the UN is a uniquely dysfunctional organization, unlike to secede. This provides the reasoning for the Chesterman analysis, because every historical example we've given, we've used offensive force in the past, has failed. They like to talk about the Côte d'Ivoire. The offensive force was not used in the Côte d'Ivoire. They like to talk about the Congo. The problem with the Congo is created a power vacuum that's actually escalated the cycle of violence. No example in the real world has offensive force ever succeeded. So why is this done? How happened? Why is offensive force go? First comes from Van Holder. It says the UN is seen as an occupation force. That's why they're seeing this, because Reuters tells you in the last offensive they've done, 1 million people were displaced. That's fueling thousands of recruits for the rebels. The second comes from Kim, with a cold drop in the rebuttal. It says the government has no incentive to negotiate when you use offensive force. The example comes from the African Policy Institute in the Congo. The Congolese government walked away from promising negotiations once the offense was announced, believing they could get better benefits if they continued to attack. Two empirics will make it very clear to vote for the negative. One is the Roberts analysis that they cold drop. Says when you use offensive force, the amount of increased violence by 680%. When you use defense, it decreases it by -3%. Second is from Pepra, who says when you use robust peacekeeping that's not offensive, it reduces civilian killings by 31%. But when you use offensive force, it increases civilian killings by 1,700. Very clear place to vote negative. Then go into their advocacy. They like to talk a lot about Russia. Couple problems. One, Russia is likely to veto the action. Second, just because Russia says they have no interest in Ukraine, they definitely have an interest in Ukraine. They're likely to block it. Then on domestic spending, recognize, one, if you escalate the conflict, more domestic spending goes up. And second, the governments are too corrupt. Even if they reduce military spending, it's not going to develop. It's just going to the pockets of Joseph Kabila and his oligarchical elite. Thank you.
All right. Okay, you guys good?
Yep.
Okay. So you say that Russia does have an interest in the conflict, even though they say they do.
Yeah,
so the point, how can Russia actually effectively veto this proposition without with maintaining that political guise that they're carrying
No
out?
one in the international community seriously believes that they have no interest in Ukraine.
Right,
By
but
vetoing it, they're not breaking, shattering any illusions that make people may
But
have.
Putin, in the country of Russia, has pretty much based all of his political standing on the fact that they're the ones being attacked, and Russia is doing something good, and they aren't actually intervening in Ukraine.
Two things left. The first one is, as you yourself probably know, Putin does not acknowledge that the Ukrainian government right there, right in there right now, is legitimate. So he's by vetoing it, he wouldn't be defending his actions in Ukraine. He'd just be voicing voicing disapproval of the government in Ukraine right now. But the second problem is that even if Russia didn't do it, they have a lot of allies. For instance, China. So even if Russia didn't do it, China could still veto it. And so even if Russia tries to maintain face, we're still not going to see action.
Why would China do that?
Because China probably doesn't want them interfering with a big superpower conflict.
Okay, but
If
China's
the UN
actually
starts doing
benefiting
something that Russia believes is contrary to their interests, Russia is probably going to be quitting the United Nations or trying to block their efforts. You need Russian cooperation. Trying to use the UN to attack Russian interests and put them on Russia's border is probably going to make the conflict much, much worse.
Okay, here's the thing though. You're still ignoring what the resolution is asking us to debate. We're talking about, in the affirmative world, they should do something. Whether it's going to happen or whether it will happen doesn't matter in today's round.
Eileen, I think you're wrong in that scenario. You do not, the affirmative get to pick and choose a single random conflict somewhere in the world. You don't get to say, in Tibet we should use it. You don't get to say, in Kashmir you could use it. When you vote pro, you give the United Nations the authority to use offensive force.
Right, but
that means you have to look to what the UN would likely do with that authority to use offensive force.
Okay.
They're not going to the Ukraine. They're probably going to continue going into the Congo,
here's the problem.
maybe into Somalia. That's what happens.
Okay, here's the problem. When you vote con, you say that the UN can never ever use offensive operations for peacekeepers.
But they
and
would.
At that point, it eliminates any chance.
It's a moot point because there's a zero probability in the status quo.
It's not
that
true.
they'll go into the
There are a
Ukraine.
lot of calls for peacekeepers to go in.
Yeah,
the rebels have
Also,
wanted peacekeepers. The Ukrainian government wants
half the
peacekeepers.
countries on the planet. Just because they're calls doesn't mean it's likely to, especially when you
What do you
consider
mean?
the internal
At the
security
point when both
politics.
parties of the conflict are calling for peacekeepers, isn't it likely that they'll intervene?
No.
No.
Why?
Because the UN would never send troops into something on the Russian border, and that could potentially antagonize Putin and the third largest military in the world. There's a reason why UN peacekeepers have never gotten involved in major superpower conflicts. It's because that would destroy the nation, the unity that the UN needs to put on.
Okay, I guess it's your turn to ask a question if you want.
Yeah, sure. So, what actually exactly did they do in Côte d'Ivoire?
We've gone over this, but you're missing the point. There are a lot of examples of offensive force. Stop focusing on the one isolated instance.
Okay, we're going to argue with the chest and evidence. All those lots of examples, all of them have failed.
Alright, let's go. Remember that when you negate in today's round, you say that UN peacekeepers can never use offensive capabilities. That's really dangerous because there are examples like we bring up with Ukraine of where offensive capabilities are needed and peacekeepers should intervene. Remember, that's what we're debating in today's round, what should happen, not what feasibly will happen. So now with that in mind, let's look at the Ukrainian conflict. Remember, the reason according to the UN why the conflict is happening right now is because Russia continues to funnel weapons and troops over the border. However, fortunately, this can be solved with offensive operations by peacekeepers on the ground, supported by UAVs that gather intelligence and give that to the peacekeepers to engage in offensive operations to stop human rights abusers. Now, my opponent's main response to this is that Russia's going to stop it from happening. Remember, they ignore the second reason why I show you that won't happen. And don't let them respond to that in final focus. It's too late. This can save face for Putin. Remember, the rebels are currently losing. Putin needs a cop-out because he's based his political career on the fact that he can have success in the Ukraine. This gives him a cop-out because he doesn't want to attack the UN. So he can say, sure, UN, go in there with your offensive operations, we'll pull out, it'll create peace in Ukraine. The reason that this outweighs my opponent's arguments is because this conflict is really large. It's already killed 10,000 people, it's displacing many more, and it has the chance to escalate into a nuclear conflict. At that point, you should feel very comfortable voting pro. But the next reason why you should vote pro is because of domestic spending. Remember, these war-torn countries, like the ones in Africa, like the Congo, are stuck in a cycle of spending where they have to devote almost all their resources to defense. Fortunately, when UN peacekeepers come into the area and use offensive operations, the local government doesn't have to use as much military force, and empirically that's resulted in a shift to spending in the health and education sector. The result of that is that we stop the root cause of conflict. Even if you believe what my opponents are telling you about conflict increasing in the short term, in the long term we stop the root cause of conflict. Now, looking at my opponent's arguments, remember the big problem. Their evidence about offensive operations, like that 680% stuff, isn't looking directly at UN operations. When we look at UN robust peacekeeping operations that include offensive operations, the number of civilian deaths decreased by 31%. That's empirically what happens, and we give you the reasons why in our first contention. Therefore, we urge an affirmative ballot.
We'll be taking a remaining minute 20. Can I leave? Well, that is. When evaluating today's round, we have to examine what would likely happen if you were to affirm and negate the resolution. And what's likely to happen is you're not going to be invading Ukraine. You're not going to be that's going to happen. If you affirm the resolution, it's not at all going to happen. We have to look at the likely consequences are. And the first likely consequence is that the conflict is actually going to escalate. It's going to ultimately be counterproductive. Remember the testament analysis. It tells you that every single time we've used offensive force in the past, it has failed. Their theory is simply contradicted by reality. Their only examples of success that they give you, all of which are examples of robust peacekeeping, but as their own author, Coffee to See a Pepper, tells you, contrast robust peacekeeping with offensive peacekeeping. Their own evidence is actually going to be evidence for us. In fact, let's examine why the conflict's actually going to get worse. The first, it comes from Van Holt, who they drop, who tells you that because the UN is seen as an occupying force, it increases rebel recruitment. That's going to be particularly bad in Ukraine, like they like to talk about, given how there's a rebel insurgency. The second analysis comes from Kim. She explains that the government has no incentive to stop fighting if they feel like the UN's always going to come on their side, and lengthening the duration of the conflict. Even if they reduce the intensity of the conflict in a place like Ukraine, since the duration is going to get longer, more civilians are going to die. But here's the really important analysis. This is from Roberts, who says that because for the same reason, there's a 680% more likely the conflict will break out again.